The house was too big for one person. Every sound echoed, stretching the silence even further. She had never liked being alone, but over the years, she had learned to live with it. Her husband's absence was nothing new. His job took him away for weeks, sometimes months. At first, she had missed him terribly, but as time passed, she grew used to the quiet. She kept herself busy, reading, cleaning, scrolling through her phone, watching shows she barely paid attention to. Anything to fill the emptiness. But some days, distractions weren't enough. Some days, the loneliness felt heavier, pressing down on her until she could hardly breathe. Her husband's best friend had always been around. He was part of their lives, trusted like family. He would drop by occasionally, check in on her, make sure she was doing okay. It was normal, innocent. That evening, he stopped by unannounced, as he often did. She didn't mind. In fact, she was relieved to have company. They sat in the living room, a comfortable silence stretching between them. He asked about her day, and she told him the usual, nothing new, nothing exciting. Then, without thinking, she sighed. A long, tired breath that gave away too much. He noticed. He always noticed. "Are you okay?" His voice was gentle, concerned. She forced a small smile. "I'm fine." But he didn't look convinced. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching her carefully. "You sure?" For a moment, she considered telling the truth. Telling him how the nights felt endless, how she hated waking up to an empty bed, how sometimes she wondered if she even mattered to her husband anymore. But she swallowed the words and nodded. "I'm just tired," she said instead. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she had said. She changed the subject, asking about his day, his work, anything to shift the focus away from herself. He played along, letting her lead the conversation somewhere lighter. But every now and then, she caught him watching her, like he wanted to say something but held back. Dinner time came, and she insisted he stay. They ate together, the conversation flowing more easily now. He made her laugh, a real, genuine laugh, something she hadn't done in a while. She poured them both a drink afterward, something her husband would have frowned upon. But he wasn't here. As they sat there, glasses in hand, a comfortable warmth settled between them. She felt lighter, almost happy. Then he said something that made her pause. "You don't have to pretend with me." She looked at him, her smile fading. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I mean, I see it. You're not fine." Her fingers tightened around her glass. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, she sighed again, softer this time. "It's just, some days are harder than others." He nodded, not pushing, just listening. "Sometimes, I just feel," she trailed off, searching for the right words. "Alone," he finished for her. She met his gaze. He understood. Maybe too much. She didn't reply, but she didn't have to. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, filled with something unspoken, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. After a while, he glanced at the clock. "I should go." She nodded, standing as he did. She walked him to the door, but before he stepped out, he hesitated. "If you ever need to talk, you know I'm here, right?" She swallowed, nodding. "I know." He gave her a small smile, then left. As the door closed behind him, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She told herself it was nothing. Just a friend checking in. Just a conversation. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. The days passed, but his words lingered. She found herself thinking about them at odd moments, while making coffee, folding laundry, staring at her phone waiting for a message that never came. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. He visited again, as he often did, but something was different. Maybe it was the way she noticed him now, the way his presence filled the empty spaces her husband left behind. Maybe it was the way their conversations lasted a little longer, the pauses stretched a little further, as if neither of them wanted to break whatever had settled between them. She caught herself watching him. The way he leaned against the kitchen counter, the way he ran a hand through his hair when he was deep in thought, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. He noticed her, too. She could tell by the way his eyes lingered, the way his gaze flickered to her lips when she spoke, the way his fingers brushed hers when he handed her something, light, fleeting touches that should have meant nothing but felt like everything. One evening it was raining. He arrived unexpectedly, soaked from the downpour. She handed him a towel, laughing at how miserable he looked. He laughed too, shaking the water from his hair. It was natural, easy, but when he looked at her, the humor faded into something else. She felt it then, a pull she had been trying to ignore. They sat together, the storm outside making the house feel smaller, more intimate. She poured them drinks, her hands steady, even though her heart was not. He watched her, his gaze unreadable. "You look different." She raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "I don't know." He tilted his head, studying her. "Lighter, maybe?" She scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't feel lighter." He didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back, sipping his drink, watching her over the rim of the glass. A comfortable silence stretched between them, but it was charged now, filled with something neither of them wanted to name. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if things were different?" she asked suddenly. He set his glass down, his expression unreadable. "Different how?" She shrugged, looking down at her hands. "Just different." A pause. Then, quietly, "Yeah. I think about it." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. She should have looked away, should have changed the subject. But she didn't. Instead, she reached out, tracing the rim of her glass with her finger. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choices." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You ever tell him?" She let out a soft laugh. "Tell him what?" "That I feel like a ghost in my own home." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't feel like that." She shrugged. "It is what it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You deserve more." She looked at him then, really looked at him. His expression was serious, his eyes dark and intense. A beat of silence. Then, she whispered, "Maybe." The rain outside grew heavier, the sound filling the space between them. She stood up abruptly, needing distance, needing air. But when she turned, he was right there, closer than he should have been. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then softly, he said, "Tell me to leave." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. His gaze flickered to her lips. She didn't tell him to leave. She didn't move at all. And that was the moment everything changed. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't step back. His presence was overwhelming, filling the space between them with something undeniable. The air felt thick, charged with everything unspoken. Neither of them moved, but everything was shifting. His hand lifted slightly, hovering just near her arm, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. He was waiting, giving her a choice. She could end this now, take a step back, say something that would pull them from the edge. But she didn't. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she looked up at him. He was searching her face, looking for doubt, hesitation, something that would stop him. But she wasn't stopping him. She wasn't stopping herself. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and traced his fingers along her wrist. A shiver ran through her, sharp and immediate. She exhaled shakily, unable to pretend this wasn't happening. "This is wrong," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. His voice was low, steady. "Then tell me to stop." She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. His fingers slid up her arm, slow, cautious. He was still waiting for her to push him away, to laugh it off, to pretend this was nothing. She didn't. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, so subtle it could have been mistaken for an accident. But they both knew it wasn't. His breath was warm against her skin. "You don't have to do this," he murmured. She knew that. She knew she could walk away right now, pretend this moment never happened. But the loneliness, the aching void inside her, was louder than reason. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she admitted softly, almost too quiet to hear. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. "You're not alone." The words undid something inside her. She closed the distance between them before she could think, before she could stop herself. His lips met hers, Tentative at first, testing, searching for hesitation. But there was none. A quiet gasp escaped her as he pulled her closer, his hands firm against her back. She melted into him, into the heat of his touch, into the way he held her like he had been waiting for this just as long as she had. It wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate. It was slow, deliberate, as if they were both memorizing every second. She felt his hands slide over her back, felt the way he trembled slightly when she pressed against him. She should have stopped. Every part of her knew that. But stopping meant going back to the emptiness, the cold, the silence. And right now, she couldn't face that. His lips trailed down her jaw, lingering at the curve of her neck. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, needing more, needing something real. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that this couldn't last, that reality would catch up to them. But right now, reality didn't exist. Right now, there was only this. Only him. The morning arrived too quickly, pulling her back into reality before she was ready. The warmth beside her was gone, replaced by an empty space that felt colder than it should have. She sat up, wrapping the sheet around herself, listening to the quiet hum of the house. He was already awake, standing by the window, his back to her. His posture was tense, his hands resting on the windowsill as if bracing himself. She watched him for a moment, knowing that whatever existed between them last night couldn't survive the light of day. Finally, he turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something heavy, something that made her chest tighten. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't the same as before. It wasn't charged with anticipation or longing. It was laced with something far more complicated. She swallowed, pulling the sheet tighter around her. "You regret it?" It wasn't a question. His jaw clenched. "Do you?" She hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? Did she regret it? The answer should have been simple. It wasn't. "I don't know," she admitted. His gaze searched hers, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. The answer was already there. She exhaled, rubbing her hands over her face. "This can't happen again." He nodded, but there was something hesitant in the way he did it, as if he wanted to argue but knew it wouldn't change anything. "Your husband's coming back," he said finally. The words hit harder than she expected. She had known, of course. It was always lingering in the back of her mind, but hearing it aloud made it real. She nodded. "Tomorrow." He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "Right?" She forced a smile, trying to lighten the weight pressing down on both of them. "It's not like I'm never going to see you again." He didn't smile back.
"Yeah."
"But it won't be the same." And they both knew it. There would be no more lingering touches, no stolen glances. Whatever had happened between them, whatever they had let themselves feel, it had to end here. She stood, reaching for her robe. He turned away slightly, giving her space, as if trying to rebuild the distance that had disappeared last night. By the time she was dressed, he was already at the door. She wanted to say something that would make this easier, but there were no right words. So instead, she simply said, "Take care." He hesitated for just a second, then nodded. "You too?" And then he was gone. She stood there for a long time after the door closed, listening to the silence that had once felt suffocating. But now, for the first time, it felt like something else. Like an ending. Or maybe, like the beginning of a secret she would carry forever.